when we think about the way that capitalism requires a dispossessed people, that is a continued violence upon a whole group of people, and that we all just live in and acknowledge as the best model for society. And so like
Yes.
it isn't just in our media and in the things that we consume, it is the waters we swim in.
Greetings and welcome to the Progressive Christians podcast. We are the love your neighbor kind of Christians and not the storm the Capitol kind. So if you're curious about what a socially and politically progressive Christian looks like, then this is the podcast for you. My name is Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter and I'm your host. I'm a professor of theology at Methodist Theological School in Ohio, and I am the lead pastor of the Loft Faith community in Westwood in Los Angeles, California. Today, we are going to be not directly talking about Charlie Kirk, but we are going to be talking about the impact of his murder and the impact of just the violence that we're seeing right now. And as you could hear, I'm joined by the podcast Super Friends. Everybody's here today. So how's everybody doing?
Hi.
Hello. Yeah, we are all here.
Look at us.
Full
Okay,
crew.
wait, but we may have some new listeners, so I'm going to name everyone. We have Wesley, Julia, Everest, Blair, and Dr. Carter. That's our crew. Welcome.
Yes, that is true. And
That's
actually,
all of us.
one of the requests thank you for those of you who have completed the survey. I should say that if you've done the survey, thank you. If you haven't completed the survey, please take 5 minutes to do it. And
Dr.
maybe
Carter loves surveys.
I do love surveys.
Data is important.
We love data.
I love data. But one of the things that got mentioned multiple times was that people want to follow us on social media and know our handles and stuff like that. And I was like, oh, I forget. I know that the face you're making, Wesley, is the same face I'm making. I'm like, I don't know. So anyway, which is
I'm
like
not
totally
on
fine.
there right now. I'm on
Yeah.
an indefinite break.
Not
I think
everybody's
it's
on
probably
social
healthy.
media.
Yeah, Dr. Carter and I are the only ones that are kind of active on TikTok and Instagram in a public way. So
Yeah.
we'll drop our handles in the show notes.
Blair had a TikTok go viral, so I'm sure
She sure
you're,
did.
Yes, she did.
You're what was that, like 90,000 or how many?
It's almost up to 500,000 views and
Yeah.
90,000 likes. It's a lot.
And
I
your
will
follower
say
count went through the roof.
It's a lot. Yeah, I went from under 1,000 followers to almost 10,000 followers
Wow.
in 6 days. I stand by what I said, and I'm gonna keep making the same kinds of content.
She
But
said
it's a
what
wild
she said.
ride.
It's
a wild
overwhelming.
ride.
She
It's
said
really
what
overwhelming.
she said. Yeah.
Yeah, so we're not gonna repeat it. We're gonna put it on here,
You can
so
go
that
find
way,
it.
that way you can find it to make it even go more viral, super viral. I don't know any of these. I sound so lame. I'm not even. I'm an old man.
But I think the best part of it is that I have been able to direct people back to the podcast because the work that y'all do, that you let me be part of, because y'all were doing this work long before I showed up. And so I'm still grateful that you let me be part of it, is what people are yearning for on that post that I made, which is Christians who are saying true things that align with the radical justice and compassion of Jesus. And there just aren't enough of us saying those things loudly. And so if you found this podcast from my post, welcome. This is way better than any post I could make by myself.
And I think the key term you hit or you said that I think is helpful for us to, I guess, move into the more conversational aspect of the podcast is truth. And I think this is, I know Wesley, we've talked about before about misinformation and disinformation or just straight up just lying. And we are just right now in a space of just like lies.
Yeah.
Like just lies. And
Spin,
it's like
propaganda.
And it's like you can't even use the Google machine. I'm like, they say stuff. I'm like, you could just type what you just said into Google and be like, well, that's not true. But people aren't thinking to do it or think they need to do it. And the inability to distinguish fact from fiction, truth from lies, is, I think, is what led us to this path. So the way we're going to frame our conversation today, and why I was talking about truth is kind of the orienting question was, how do we take time to process violence in this particularly violent society. As we were doing our prep, Wesley raised this question, and that's just like so poignant because we are in a society right now where violence is so normalized, and so people have grown numb to violence. And the murder that we witnessed of Charlie Kirk aroused people in a particular kind of way, in part because they connected to him, I would argue, as I said on Sunday, because of what he looked like. Sometimes for some people, in order to actually feel something or to grieve, someone has to look like you to trigger that in you, but not for everybody. But for some people, clearly that was a thing. And I think it should force us to confront the reality that rather than saying when things like this happen and people say, oh, this isn't who we are, I'm like, actually, this is the problem is this is who we are. Like, this clearly is who we are. And it's really, really, it sucks. Like, it just sucks. It hurts. It hurts deeply. And so we're talking about moral injury, or framing it, a lot of our conversation around the concept of moral injury. And this was in part thanks to an email that we got from one of our listeners, Matt Kershaw. And Matt would have already received an email by me by the time this podcast is posted. Matt's email, I thought was really powerful. And Blair, I know you copied some in this. I was going to turn over you, let you kind of read some of the key parts of it that we want to kind of lift up.
So Matt gave us a really great framing, but the part I'm going to share right now that is going to frame the rest of our conversation, Matt wrote, I'm a combat veteran, Marines, Afghanistan, with some experience in, scenes very much like the one we all saw 5 days ago. And when I got home from combat service, I personally found the knee-jerk response of ministers and theologians to my experience was to instinctively jump to moral evaluations around the acts of killing themselves, and not really dealing with the psychology and warped hermeneutic that led up to / followed the moral injury. People from conservative spaces wanted to justify my experience as patriotic and self-sacrificial, while liberals just wanted to help me recognize myself as caught up in a violent system within which I had limited agency. But neither seemed interested in doing the actual soul work needed after watching someone die suddenly and violently right in front of you, or being involved in, directly or indirectly, the violent death of another human being. And Matt, your wife will be happy because we linked your Substack in the show notes. So if y'all like what Matt has to say, he's doing writing around analyzing the life and work of 5 gay poets as saintly figures who can reorient our vision of human nature to see others as Christ sees them. So y'all check out Matt's work. But this paragraph in particular hit me so hard.
I have a question about that. What is this word?
Hermeneutic.
What is this word? Am I supposed to know this word?
You will learn this word.
You'll learn it, yeah.
Shortly,
okay,
Julia,
well, thank you.
As you begin your formal theological studies, and we're so proud of you.
Thank you.
Hermeneutic is like the lens through which you're reading and analyzing scripture. So you could have a feminist hermeneutic or a liberative hermeneutic. And so Matt is asking us, what is the lens, basically, that allows us to participate in violence? And then what is the lens we can use to understand it after we've experienced or witnessed acts of violence?
Yeah. And so I think this leads into, and I've had some posts, for those of you who do follow me on social media, about the myth of redemptive violence, which we're going to spend much more time unpacking. And so if you're actually curious about where I'm getting that content from, it's in Walter Wink's book, Engaging the Powers. I think the myth, it's chapter 1, the myth of the domination system. And he just does it. This book, it's old, but this book is amazing. Like,
if I were to recommend like one book to help people understand progressive theology, it's Walter Wink's Engaging the Powers.
Yeah. And it's like
so good.
Before I unpack that, I want to tell a story about a friend of mine who was in the military, in the Army, and then tie that into the myth of redemptive violence. So one of my friends from high school, he joined the Army right after high school. He went to the Army, and I was supposed to go to the Air Force. I did a bunch of testing and was feeling like this is the only way I'm going to get out of my tiny hometown. And I felt like the Air Force was like the nerdier branch of the military, so I thought I would be like safer for lots of reasons, family reasons. I ended up not being able to join. And then September 11th happened, and I was grateful I didn't join, because my friend who was in the Army and was an Army Ranger at that point was deployed. And so my friend would write letters about what he was doing in Afghanistan, and they were really, really difficult to read because he was suffering, because we grew up in this moderate to conservative Christian environment where you were taught to not kill or not do violence, not do harm, unless you were like hunting. And he would express how much he was struggling with what he was doing, but he felt like what he was doing in Afghanistan was more. He felt like there was a moral justification. He felt like these people attacked our country. However, when he was deployed to Iraq is when he really began to struggle, because he saw more wanton abuse. He saw more. Wesley, you might be able to help me think, or Money, I might help me think of the terms when you have contract soldiers.
Like mercenaries?
Mercenaries that were hired, and he witnessed more death of children, and he was asked to do things that he really struggled with. So he was in for 6 years, and when he got out, I picked him up, me and his sister, and we brought him home, and we had seen him a few times when he was on leave, but he was obviously just really going PTSD, just all kinds of depressed. So what we did the first probably 3 months he was out, I would go over to his house every couple of days, and we would play chess and maybe say a total of like 30 words. That was it. I'd be there for a couple hours. We play chess or play video games. He just didn't have much to say. And he just said, thanks for coming over. And we would just play chess and play video games. And it took him a long time to kind of come back to decompress, to come back to himself. And years have gone by. Obviously, this was, in the early 2000s. And he is a sheriff actually in Seattle. And he is the kind of sheriff that I would hope if I ever got pulled over by a sheriff, I would be like him, because he's like a good person. What he talks about was how what he needed when he came back was just time to kind of understand, and he had space to feel, and his feelings felt so overwhelming because he felt torn up about what he was asked to do, and he was really concerned for the state of his soul in a way that isn't like some of the conversations we've had around, oh, I'm afraid to go to hell, but like, for lack of a better term, like the Voldemortian sense, where like when you murder someone, like a part of you leaves, right? Like, and so he really, really struggled. And it was my first honest reckoning with death and seeing it in my friend's eyes. And I think through therapy, through his wife, and he's so much better now, but it's something he still carries with him. I wish I had access to what I know now around the theological understandings of this myth of redemptive violence from Walter Wink, because that is what he was being taught while he was in the military through his chaplain, that this idea that somehow violence, as he was perpetrating it, was justified. And so what the myth of redemptive violence, as defined by Walter Wink, is basically the laws of proportional justice. And I want to be clear, actually, because I know there's some people who are in the military, they're going to listen to this and be like, when I'm talking about redemptive violence, am I talking about individual, moral, personal, global? As we are having this conversation, it's much more about political violence within the frameworks, political violence and moral injury on an individual level. So when I'm talking about violence on a social structural level, like, should the U.S. have a military? Do we intervene in war? That's broader than the conversation I want to have today, right? It's not the kind of conversation we're going to have right now. Often when we get to the things about just war theory, we've not done, I would argue, as a nation or as a national leaders, done the work to put ourselves in position to not have war, right? Like, it's like we wait until say, oh, well, now these things are happening. What are we going to do? Well, you know what? There was 18 other steps we could have did before we got to this point that we haven't done. And we need to hold our people and leadership accountable to do those things, right? Like, what's happening right now with Venezuela. You can't keep blowing up Venezuelan boats and not expect Venezuela to do something. And then be like, well, now should we not attack Venezuela? They attacked us. Well, we could have not blown up their boats. Like, that's what I mean. Like let's actually not do the stuff that leads up to war.
The grounding of this like ancient myth of an eye for an eye, right?
Yeah,
That if someone harms you, then the way to justify or make right, justify literally means to like make flat or make level. So to justify act of violence against you, to make it equal, you have to perform an act of violence back. And that's like what undergirds the entirety of the myth of redemptive violence, in my understanding of it.
Yeah. And so it's really, again, the foundation of our laws of what we might call proportional justice, as you just described. And this is the laws of proportional justice that, in fact, are written in the Levitical code, in the ancient Israelite practice, in Leviticus 24:17 through 21. Where it says, if anyone kills another person, they must be executed. Someone who kills an animal may make amends for it, a life for a life. If someone injures a fellow citizen, they will suffer the same injury they inflicted. Broken bone for broken bone, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. The same injury the person inflicted on the other will be inflicted on them. Someone who kills an animal must make amends for it, but whoever kills a human being must be executed. There is but one law on this matter for you, immigrant or citizen alike, because I am the Lord your God. Right. So this is Israelite religion. Now, I'm going to get to the part where Jesus actually undoes this, but I want to be clear. People are going to go to that passage and forget that Jesus says, you have heard it was says an eye for an eye. Right. So Jesus actually undoes a lot of this thinking. But anyway, so by redemptive violence, I mean the idea that somehow justice, goodness, and peace can be brought about through violence. The idea that violence has redeeming qualities, or the idea that violence can somehow be seen as a good. And within this framework, violence can become salvific. It's understood as a means of acquiring salvation because we internalize the belief that violence, when done by the right people and for the right reasons, will save us. Now, Wink calls this a myth because he's gesturing towards its mythic beginnings, right? This idea and the reality of the creation narratives that are Babylonian creation narratives, which exists in some other traditions as well, but let's just say these because these are the ones that are the foundation for Western values, where the creation narratives are violent. Like it is the tearing apart of a woman, a female deity that is in the insides of the female deity are used to create everything. And so it just starts it so within this creation myth there is no sin that introduces evil. It just starts with evil, right? Like there's no mystery of evil. Like it's just a fact. Like this is it, like it is what it is. But within the biblical tradition, there is a time before evil, right? There is this time, there's this poetic time that we tell ourselves before evil was introduced into the world. And so what we have with this particular kind of myth of buying into this myth of saying that, well, we have rear in the fall, and so therefore this myth is how we're actually redeemed. We see it played out in the way in which even our conversation we had last week with Dr. Crinks around the violence that's justified by police and the violence that's justified by military. And this to me, it's manifest in even what we see in popular culture, right? So you're talking about what we see in TV, what we see in film with superheroes or vigilantes, and how in particular these vigilantes, like things like Marvel or Avengers or whatever, they're using violence for the sake of good, or supposed to believe. And so they are using violence rather than the democratic norms. They are using violence rather as a functional necessity because people don't have either the courage or the wisdom or the capacity to actually work together and solve their problems. Because it's not going to make a good movie if you just say, "Hey, there's these people come in, they're attacking. Let's all have let's have a democratic Congress and discuss what we should do."
Restorative justice does not make for a good movie.
Yeah,
restorative justice processes would not make a good cartoon.
Yeah, and so this is how we get to where we are, right? Where violence is normalized and everything, and especially in popular culture, right? Like we see it all the time, whether it's propaganda or these films where the vigilante justice is upheld as the way to get justice, and this creates a culture where acts like we've witnessed this past week are can be seen as somebody could think of them as doing a good thing. They can think of themselves as doing a good thing. And so I know I have said enough to set the stage for the myth of redemptive violence. So that I'm just curious about what y'all thoughts about that myth or how you see it even shaping our current social political context and what we see happening right now.
Well, I think one of the things that's interesting that we didn't get into the conversation with Dr. Crinks was when we think about the way that capitalism requires a dispossessed people, that is a continued violence upon a whole group of people, and that we all just live in and acknowledge as the one the best model for society. And so like
Yes.
it isn't just in our media and in the things that we consume, it is the waters we swim in.
But this is also a kind of redemptive violence, I think, Wesley. What you're saying is like, in order for the economy to work, quote unquote, we have
the greater
to be
good.
right. We have to be able to abuse and dehumanize a certain subset of people's bodies, because that labor or that deconstruction of the body is necessary for the communal flourishing. And I think you're so right that plays directly into the myth of redemptive violence, when in reality we could choose to build a society where all people flourish, instead of a society where a small set of people flourish and everyone else suffers.
What I loved about Krink's book is he makes sure we understand this isn't just about race, that it's so much about class, because its origins are in the West and Britain, where it's white people, dispossession white people, right? It's like them
and women and children.
Yeah, and like what I did not have a good enough understanding of until I read his book was just the violence through which they used to dispossess people of the commons. I was like, this is like, how could you think this is good? Like, people have been living on this land for generations, and then you say, "Oh, we're gonna kick them off the land so they can go work in the factories." And just as you said, yeah, it is in essence, it's redemptive violence. Like, oh, this is what has to happen for me to have private property to move people to this space for the greater good of our economy or their particular profits. It was wild. Like, it was. I hope some of y'all got that book, because that book was so good. But yeah, so Julia,
we were talking about media, but about art, and that art imitates life, which imitates art, which imitates life, and so on. It's like a chicken or the egg situation. But
as long as it's a vegan chicken.
A vegan chicken.
We love vegan chickens.
A vegan egg. But Carter, I know I've talked to you about the importance of reading specifically, and why I think we're in this situation is that people don't read, and people don't read fiction. And reading fiction, not watching it, but reading it like a book. Remember books? And you read it, and it's the only activity where we use our imagination to like build a whole world. And I think that as people read less, that is a practice. That's like a skill to be able to imagine something different. And I think that what we are suffering is a suffering of a lack of imagination. And like generations, decades of like not nurturing people's imaginations to be able to imagine anything else. Now here we are. Look at us. How's it going? How's it going? Are you having fun yet?
No, I'm not.
No, actually, I'm gonna toss it to Everest, but I want to read this statistic because I thought this fits the point you're making. I knew that because
I know what stat you're about to read.
Well, I don't know. Maybe you don't. I don't know. But we've talked about this in the book club, because we have 2 separate book clubs at our church. If you're interested, you can find us on the Loft and sign for the book club. We have a few podcast listeners who are in our book clubs. One that's fiction and one that's nonfiction. And so the statistic was by this organization called the Book Club Forum. But it says men read fiction. Oh, no, the National Endowment of the Arts. I'm sorry. Men read fiction at a significantly lower rate than women. 2022 National Endowment for the Arts study found that of people who read, 29% of men read fiction compared to 50% of women. While women are more likely to read fiction, the gap has narrowed from earlier studies because men and our current generation of men are reading more fantasy and science fiction. But it's still about, a significant gap in terms of men who read fiction, especially. But fiction as such, men tend to read,
self-help books, how to win friends and influence people.
Basically, yeah.
I thought you were going to talk about how they say that the Department of Education says that 28% of adults perform at the lowest literacy level, equivalent to a 3rd grade reading level, and that 21% are functionally illiterate.
Dang.
But that's, oh God, that's crazy.
That's sad. What?
I throw my hands up, they're playing my song.
Listen, Sunday school started not as a way to teach young children about God. It started as a way to teach young children how to read, because they were working all week. Children didn't go to school. And so Sunday school was the church's way of stepping in to teach children how to read so that they could engage with scripture and participate in society. So I don't know. Maybe we need to go back to like Sunday school being basic literacy.
Well, I could do an episode on the education system and literacy and why that's happening. This is a special interest of mine, so not going to go off on that. But I'm circling back to a few comments ago. I should have written it down. I think when Wesley was talking about
capitalism and dispossession of people being violent.
Dispossession. Well, I think that is like when we're talking about processing violence, I think I've seen a lot of conversation about that in the last week because a lot of us like accidentally opened our phones and saw a video of someone getting shot in the neck, and that was really jarring and horrific. I don't think that it's true that there's a lot of people that are like, that is okay. I think that there are a lot of people that kind of resent the tidal wave of grief happening while we have, I think if you have been paying attention to Palestine at all, you have been seeing so much horrific violence that has been impossible to process and grieve in any real way. I guess I just wanted to also bring that into the conversation because I was like, that it is true that we are witnessing like violence in our country that is really alarming. I think the resentment that was happening was coming from people being like, but where have you been? Like, this is not the most horrific thing we have seen in the last week, actually, like, unfortunately. And like, where has the grief been for that? Which I think that's like redemptive grief. I don't even know. There's like a weird, like, who deserves our compassion, who deserves our empathy. But I do think that it's like a fair point and it's a feeling that I understand.
Yeah, I mean, I just put some statistics in the chat. I mean, like, so according to the Gun Violence Archive, there have been 10,614 homicides in America this year, 19,384 injuries, 304 mass shootings. So that's incidents with 4 or more shot, not including the shooter. 171 children below the age of 11 killed, and 723 teenagers, people between ages 12 and 17. And so, like, yeah, this is what I mean about, and I know we're going to get to moral injury. I'm like, we are living in a violent culture. And I think trying to understand what's happening, trying to process it and be like, well, how is this so normal? Like, how do we allow this to happen? Is where I kind of find myself. Even if people are trying to tell me to have grief, I feel like I'm like, I have been grieving the violence that I've seen and experienced and internalized, not just physical violence, but a psychological violence of knowing that like if I go out here and I get shot and all the work I'm doing, like actual physical, like justice oriented work, like ain't no Los Angeles City Council member gonna be like, let's fly for like a half staff. Like ain't nobody gonna be like marching in the streets or demanding like, black justice. And because it's this, things are set up such that my life, if it's taken away, the assumption is going to be I did something to deserve that to happen.
There's
right?
just another number.
And that is what frustrates me. And that does harm. Like that does harm. That does harm to me. It does harm to my wife. Right? So that she knows when I go somewhere and I go speak somewhere and I'm talking about racial justice and I'm talking about the things I talk about, she is worried. She is actually concerned that I may not come home. Now, maybe y'all like, so I want you to, for our listeners, like to understand that that's what she has to carry. Right. And so, yes, that's why I was so glad Matt sent that email, because I was like, yes, this is a help more of a topic because it allows us to talk about just the junk, and I almost cursed, the junk that we have to carry every day, because we want to actually push back against these systems of injustice and dehumanization, because we want to tell the truth rather than be caught up in lies. And there's a passage in Isaiah that is coming to my mind, and it's in Isaiah 30s. I can't remember, about believing the lies. But I know, Blair, you wanted to share something, so I'm gonna turn it over to you before I start preaching again.
Yeah, and no, that's important. And the first time my husband has had to grapple with the fact. I've told him for a long time that I'm going to end up on all the lists. Like I'm going to talk about true things and I'm going to end up on all the lists. And this week, after having a viral video and having one threat against our children, is the first week that he has actually had to like sit and grapple with that as a potential reality, that like someone could also, yes, that people who stand up and say, actually, violence is not the way we ought to live, and violence will not save us, and violence will not redeem us, and the calling people into a harder, better way, that actually creates a threat against your life. That's part of the myth of redemptive violence. And we have to turn our broken system into a fake story of salvation in order to manage the cognitive dissonance that violence is inherently bad. Like when we witness violence, whether we're perpetrating it, experiencing it, or witnessing it, there is a like neurological reaction in our bodies of threat and fear. And the more we experience and witness violence, the more used to that threat and fear our body becomes. And it either processes it and we become numb, or it fails to process it and we become violently reactive. And that's part of what happens in post-traumatic stress disorder, is your body either becomes numb to just emotions because the fear reaction is so over amplified, or your body becomes overreactive and heightened and you respond to things that are not threatening as threats. And that is what is happening sort of in the bodies of our veterans and other people who have experienced violence. But we live in such a violent society, and we're coming to recognize that, and we're witnessing it more and more, that we are all experiencing some level of post-traumatic stress disorder and don't know what to do with it. And that's part of why I think we're seeing people either become more and more numb and willing to like sort of give up their rights and their brains and their bodies to whoever tells them they will keep them safe, or we're becoming more and more reactive and more violent towards each other. Julia was going to jump in.
I'm thinking about the introduction to White Property, Black Trespass, is that what it's called? And him writing about how he grew up in a conservative, all-white community where they were told about this violence outside that they didn't see or experience, but they were told about it. And then it created this fear. And that fear makes me think of Charlie Kirk, because that is what be believed in. And like, I'm looking at the statistics that you dropped in this chat, and it's like, to see these statistics and say this is why we should all be able to be armed at all times is like a crazy thing to me. But then it makes me think about like the definition of moral injury. Moral injury names how the lived experience of armed conflict can damage an individual's ethical foundations, often with serious consequences. The potential for moral injury to clarify the impact of political violence lies in its focus on how traumatic experience can affect an individual's ethical grounding and their sense of connection to the good, and how in order to like make sense of the world, because that's all our minds do, right? Like all any of us are trying to do is make sense of what we see around us, what we're being told through the media, what we see in our day-to-day, like what we experience. And to try to make sense of it, like you can't live in this world and like in these bodies, especially the people in this chat, and not in this chat, in this pod, in this room, in this space, us, the five of us, me included, and not have to make some sort of like, how do you have to justify what you see? Like Wesley knows this. I am like a little bit pro-violence, not because I think it's good. I don't think it's good I think it's very, very bad, but I also think that maybe it can be effective. I don't know what it affects, and like effective towards what, to what end, I don't know. But people respond, and sometimes words don't make them respond.
And this is why the podcast is helpful, because not all of us agree on everything, right?
But you get to a point that you're like, what else are we supposed to do? Like, I actually understand, because I'm like, okay, we have been watching a genocide happen. I have grown up seeing school shooting after school shooting after school shooting. I have like never been in a public space that I have not been like, where would I go if someone started shooting a gun? That is like what, and like I have spent my whole life doing political advocacy. I have like tried to hold my representatives accountable. I have tried to like have all of the, do all of the things that
Do
you're
the right
supposed to do.
things.
And I'm with you. I'm like, I do not think that violence is good. I don't know what we're supposed to do. Like, I actually don't. So I just want to validate you. I don't think that you're crazy.
Thank you.
Well, and that paralysis that you're describing, Everest, of like not knowing what else to do, that is a manifestation of moral injury. That is evidence of moral injury, because moral injury, the way I've always described it, is knowing internally what the right thing is to do and being prevented from doing it. And so we know we're not supposed to kill or harm other people. That's like ingrained in us as children, right? Don't hit, whatever. And then we send people into someone else's society and say it's now your ethical responsibility to kill them. And that messes up your internal ethical clock, basically, the way you judge what is right and what is wrong. It makes you kind of question everything. And moral injury is now also being studied in healthcare settings, because doctors and nurses know how to care for patients. And the restrictions placed upon them by healthcare being processed as a capitalist business instead of a human rights organization of care, doctors and nurses are prevented from doing the right thing they have been trained to do to care for another human being's body because of restrictions of money or policy. And so then they're experiencing moral injury of like, I know how I have been trained how to care for these bodies, and I am being told I am not allowed to do that or not able to do that. And so we're all kind of experiencing this of like, we were raised with this idea that like God's justice is good, God's justice is final, we're not supposed to hit, we're not supposed to call names, we're not supposed to do harm. And suddenly it feels like the only way to survive is to participate in the violent actions to protect ourselves, which is creating its own kind of mass public trauma and mass experience of moral injury.
Yeah, and I think
But
this
is that
is
true? Wait.
Yeah, I'm
Is that
wondering
true?
where
Is it
where are
true?
we choosing to participate in this violence?
Is it true that we all are taught that
Also
all
that.
violence is
too.
bad? I don't think that we're all taught that. Maybe all of us here were taught that, but I do know that there are people who are like, well, some people have to die for me to have a cell phone. I've had this conversation with people.
Good
So like,
God.
I don't even know that we agree on that.
No, I agree. I mean, I think that clearly the episode we did, again, this is why I want to encourage y'all to read Dr. Krink's book. Like, if you have a concept of hell, Everest, we just had a conversation like 2 weeks ago. Like, your concept of hell, if it's created through the framework of the satisfaction atonement, this idea that Jesus had to die, that Jesus is the satisfaction, that God requires death of God's self to pay for sins. Otherwise, you go to this particular kind of the understanding of hell, right? Then punishment, death, and violence is morally justified by God. You have divinely sanctioned it, right? And so we have to reimagine like our eschatologies, reimagine our thinkings around atonement, which we've done. Again, we can link this in the show notes too. Like, we've talked about this before on this podcast around how to think about theories of salvation. I know we have a lot of new listeners now, and so maybe we need to do it again. I do think more people, even if they're not explicitly taught that violence is okay, right? Because we can even go to I'm pointing to the book behind me of Star Spangled Jesus, because I know that April basically said that they were taught, hey, America doing things for war is basically a holy war, right? And so there is a normalization of violence. And what I want to say again, and when we get to the end about what the solution is, I'm gonna be quoting Jesus, because Jesus said, he's like, I heard someone who said this is not the way, but it does feel like it's easy to get lost in it. But I know, Wesley, I want to go back to you.
I fully see that concept of hell and the ways that some Christian denominations or traditions have atonement theories that in some ways justify violence as a way of salvation or whatever. And I totally hear what everyone's saying about redemptive violence and sort of like it in some people's minds it posits a purpose behind the violence for the accomplishment of something. I guess I'm wondering in the last handful of shootings of big violent events, it seems like these shooters, and particularly the one that just happened last week, that it is violence for the sake of violence. It is a what the internet calls an shit post, but like in real life, where the use of memes that only make sense within the context of a very small group. Well, I don't know how big it is because it's on the internet. A group of people who feel so disconnected from society that their nihilism is, well, we're going to do this for the lulz. You know, if you are reading this, you are gay, Lamau. Like that is violence for violence sake. There is no, it doesn't feel like there's a larger purpose. So we're moving into this space. We as a society are moving into the space that it is, there is no redemptive even arc connected to some of these things. So like what, how do we begin to even process that?
And I think that's a manifestation of the warped, like how deeply warped our society has become by the perpetuation and the normalization of violence, such that instead of violence being a thing that causes a visceral reaction of fear, violence or the witness of violence because of the way I hate to, I'm not blaming video games. Video games don't make you violent. But when you're embedded in a hermeneutic of violence, where violence is a glorified thing, where warriorhood is the ultimate manhood, where you get dopamine hits from shooting things on a screen, and not just shooting them, but like watching bodies explode in dramatically realistic and violent ways. Like that is actually like, I don't know. I'm sure there's studies on this, but I would guess it's actually changing our neuroscience. Like it's shifting us from thinking that the witness of violence is something to be avoided, and instead moving this subculture, this subset of society towards thinking that violence is the thing to be pursued, as you said, for the sake of violence. And I think that that's a brokenness that is incredibly difficult to overcome when it's become so deeply embedded that it's like changing our brain chemistry.
Yeah, and I think what also comes to mind is like even in the Christian church, as we were talking in the conversation with April, Teen Mania, that's not what it was called. It was Team Force, Team something.
No, teen mania.
Okay.
I mean, but like literally a mania, right? So like mania is a mental condition of overactivation of the brain.
And in the documentary or Shiny Happy People, that second episode where they're literally training, like putting these kids through physical training to be warriors, to like, yeah, boot camp. Yes, thank you. Framing their life as a battle. Like it's not just coming from outside of the church; it's coming from within the church. These framings, and so like, yeah, it's a we live in weird, broken times.
Horrible.
Well, I mean, I think this is the danger of using the language of like spiritual warfare and using it in a way where you are clearly not being metaphorical, right? Where you're talking about spiritual warfare, but you're saying you have to be willing to die for these things. When you are a leader, whether it be a political or religious leader, and you explicitly talk about like what you have to be willing to give up your life for, willing to fight for, willing to die for. But in truth, again, this is where you're not. I believe these people actually, they don't want to die themselves, but they're telling you that you should be able to do it, right? Like they're saying something they actually genuinely don't fully believe themselves internally. Like I honestly, truly believe that. And I said this on the post that I made, about redemptive violence, about Charlie Kirk, is that I think a lot of people, they believe in redemptive violence because they think they'll be saved from the worst kinds of violence. Yep. They don't think they'll be victims of the worst kinds of violence. But in fact, like you can, like, like that is the hope that, and that it like siding with the dominant culture, will not save you. And I think, so Wesley, this is kind of my general answer to your question, right? Because I want to start moving us towards moving towards the end of this episode and wrapping up and moving towards solutions. And I want to go back to, I guess, to keep this within the theological framework, the way we talk about sin and how we define sin, or how to define sin, building on the work of Jim Keenan, as a failure to bother to love, right? And how that fundamentally to me captures sin in general. That's the way Jesus defines sin, is the failure to bother to love. And I think that's explicitly laid out in the parable of the Good Samaritan, where the priest and the Levite, they step aside of the injured man because the man could be dead, and they don't want to break the codes of cleanliness, and so they don't want to they would rather have a external purity rather than an internal kind of purity, is what Jesus ultimately is going to say. And so again, they failed to bother to love. And so in this sense, what I believe is that we begin to experience our sins, or our failures to bother to love, the way in which we can promote kind of meme culture and just do things for the sake of doing it, as a kind of self-serving illusion, where we reframe our failures as love in ways that make us look like heroes, right? So rather than seeing it as a failure to love, we see ourselves as a hero, right? We have to like almost spiritually bypass it. And so this is what I mean, like when wealthy people like say, well, I'm not being greedy, I'm just being prudent, even though they're literally hoarding wealth, right?
Or the prosperity
Like,
gospel, right? We create the prosperity gospel to say those who have the most wealth are blessed, because otherwise we would have to grapple with the reality that the only way to accumulate mass amounts of wealth is to violently impose dehumanization on other people.
yeah, and like even how we'll have like deny benefits, or I'm trying to think of the one statistic. Okay, it was we pass. So I have this one quote: we will pass anti-trans legislation, quote unquote, to keep kids safe, when in fact it is those children who are suffering and literally committing self-harm, right? Like they're way more likely to commit self-harm. And so we're actually doing things under the name of keeping them safe, when in fact we know we're actually causing more harm to to the kids who are actually experiencing the most suffering in the name of love, right? When it's actually, that's what I'm saying, it's not love. It is sin. It is a failure to bother to love, that that people reframe in a way to make themselves like a hero in their own story. And fundamentally, I think this goes back to theological anthropology. Like, I think it's because we don't see each other. We fail to see each other as human beings. We fail to see ourselves as human beings, to actually feel what's going on. Um, and I think this is the beginnings of what could be a solution, which is why I've been talking about theological anthropology probably for the last 10 years. Blair?
Well, and I think it's not just that it's a failure to bother to love, but it's a failure to love as God loves. And Dr. Carter, it was so poignant when you raised the point in this conversation around the myth of redemptive violence, that the story of creation in Christianity and Judaism, in our shared scripture, is not a creation that begins with violence, but a creation that begins with loving
love.
Formation. And the fall, quote unquote, is when we discern or discover that we have the choice not to love as God loves. And that's what sort of starts this like snowball effect of evil in the world, is that when we realize that violence actually is an option, that not loving as God loves is an option. And this is also why I think it is so critically important that Christians who understand that creation story, that we were not made evil, we were made good. We were made from good and for good, and that is the root of our religion. That's why it's so important for us to be speaking back against Christians who have co-opted or forgotten or failed to understand that part of our shared story, and are choosing instead to return to this myth of violence. Like, it is critically important that we not just call out that violence, but to name that that violence itself is against the foundations of our Christian religion and our Christian story.
And I think this is where, I mean, the passage in Isaiah I was thinking about was Isaiah 5, where it's verses 8 through, I think, through the end, or 8 through 23, where I mean, one right here is that woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and shrewd in their own sight. Woe to those who are heroes in drinking wine and dying at mixing drink, who acquit the guilty for a bribe, whoop, whoop, and deprive the innocent of their rights. So I think that I want to wrap up with the questions that we had in there. Like, what is it like? How do we begin to heal? It's like, what do we do? Like, like what do we do? Like, I have some ideas. I have some things I'm going to suggest, but I'm curious. Like, how do we begin to heal? What are y'all thoughts, or what are y'all trying to do to begin the process? What advice can we give our listeners? This is where our listeners will see there is silence.
Well, because it's difficult. Because I don't know what to do.
Yeah, and that's fair. That's
Because
fair.
it's one thing to like. I think so many of the initial reactions to the situation last week were from people who saw themselves not just, maybe not even in the figure of Charlie Kirk, but in what he was doing in terms of getting in front of people and sharing an opinion. I would say he was sharing other things, but Ezra Klein's piece, his opinion piece, awful take, but he was seeing himself more as a potential victim at that point. What do you do when you can't step onto a train platform without seeing six police officers and think, if I make the wrong move, I'm a target? What do you do? How do you deal with the daily violence of knowing that the Trump administration has made it so that if you look brown and you're around a Home Depot, you could be picked up? What do you like? I didn't see myself a potential victim of a shooting from publicly speaking, but I see myself a potential victim of the daily violence of this country, and I don't know what to do with that. So it's just like I I guess you I guess I form relationships and friendships with people, and I talk to them, and I sort of express these frustrations to feel heard and feel seen, and maybe that's the only comfort that I can take in the moment. I don't know.
I think it was in the pre-show I mentioned, because we had our gospel choir concert this Sunday, and so we had rehearsal on Saturday, and so I was in a room with a lot of Black people, and the news of last week was at the front of everyone's minds because everyone was really activated and like triggered by like
Collective sadness that people were
yeah, not
having.
just the sadness, it's like the martyrdom almost. It's like
Yeah, the martyrdom.
really it like I can feel it right now as I sit here even thinking about it. What it implies the majority of white people in this country think of me. It's like a new trauma in and of itself. And I keep coming back to this place where it's like, how, again, I can't answer the question, because how am I to heal when the trauma is ongoing?
Well, I just really feel the same. I feel the same. I I was trying to Google who it is, but there is I'm sure you guys saw it. There was a woman that, like, when she thought the shooter was trans, she, like, was using the T slur and, like, saying horrible things. And then when the shooter was a white man, she was like, Charlie Kirk would want us to pray for this man
Nancy
and
Mace.
include him in our idea of God's kingdom. And I was like, what an explicit way to be like, I mean, it just like, and it's not, I mean, obviously it's not just trans people. I'm just like the way that, like, me, my community, people that I love are being spoken about, the way that we are, like, so denied a place in, like, what grace looks like in this country and what love looks like in this country and what community looks like and what empathy looks like. Sorry, all three of us were like, we don't know. I don't know. I am in, like, a real grim place about this. Like, I think the moral injury is, like, a good concept to talk about because I'm like, yeah, I know that I am against violence. I hate that I am in a world that I'm having to, like, really look within myself and be like, okay, but remember, Everest, that public acts of violence are bad. Like, focus in on that. You know that. because I know who I am, and I know that that is naturally what I believe. And I feel like we are in this like current moment that is pushing all of us to extreme, terrible places. And I feel really scared and I feel really sad. And in general, I'm like I don't know. I'm like so tired of trying to like figure out how to live in while witnessing so much violence, while holding grief, while also holding compassion for the people that are perpetrating violence, that are, I don't know. So I have no answer. I don't know how we heal. I'm in the wounded place.
I think holding all of you so eloquently and bravely sharing like your own experiences of this, and the fact that this isn't new, right? The reality of the perpetuation of violence is something I think everyone on in this podcast in different ways has always carried, because of none of us are the archetype of the white man, right? We have all had violent aspects of society pointed towards us at different times. And I'm just, as I'm holding that and hearing that from you all, I'm remembering that the destiny of the oppressed and the oppressor are intimately linked. And that basically, like, this is why the myth of redemptive violence doesn't work, because we cannot stop systems of violence by overtaking violence with more violence, because all that does is perpetuate and turn, that who was oppressed into being the oppressor. What we have to do is eliminate the myth of domination altogether, and that requires that everyone heal. And you cannot heal when you're being actively wounded. And it's the world's biggest group project, and none of us can do it alone. And so perhaps the question is not how do we heal. Perhaps that's the question I need to direct to people like my loving husband, who is a white man, right? Like, how have you healed? And then how can you help other white men heal? Because right now they're the ones who are doing the most violence. So that's your job. And then perhaps the question isn't how do we heal for those of us who are the greatest recipients of violence. Perhaps the question is how do we sustain until redemption is possible.
Or even how do we create a culture of healing, right? Where healing is normalized, where healing is not seen as an ongoing process through which we continue to return to each other with care and grace. And I think it's going to be much more about, as you said, Blair, addressing the larger structural issues where people are allowed to be vulnerable and talk about the suffering that they carry and the woundedness that they carry, because violence, if seen as successful, paradoxically creates more violence, right? So it does not work. Like, the only way we get out of this is if we actually stop and realize that in order for us to live flourishing lives, everyone has to be able to live a flourishing life. Otherwise, someone's always going to think you're taking something from them if they believe you don't have their best intentions at heart. I want to end by reading a little more from Matt's email, and then I say some things and I'll wrap up. Matt wrote, ultimately, the death of Christ is the archetypal trauma and the narrative through which such things ought to be explored. In my view, people who live in post-traumatic hermeneutic are well positioned to understand theologies of death, and therefore we also are better positioned in the subsequent productive of narratives of resurrection and the new possibility without being trite about the death part. And I think for me, I realized that I think the way I take this seriously and continue to process healing is through a remembering of what my ancestors have had to go through and what I've had to go through in my life, and take that very seriously. Julia, I talked about this with your mother, in terms of the fact that, your mother was taught by people who actually knew enslaved people, and that our enslavement is just that close that we still can touch it, and realizing that they had to imagine that I could be some, like, who I am. Like, it was not in there. They had to imagine and hope that there could someday be someone who looks like me that can have the title Reverend Doctor in front of their names, right? And so that gives me hope. I also have to recognize the fact that in thinking about this through the lens of Jesus, I know the only way I can actually wake up every day and go into the world is I've committed myself to loving my neighbor as I love myself. That I have to see people as full human beings, as beloved children of God. And I know that the only way I can persuade them to not respond to me in violence is if I humanize them in that way, shape, or form. And I don't know that it's going to work all the time. And in fact, that's the whole point about this, what Matt just said about Jesus. Like, Jesus did this and they murdered him, right? So might it cost my life? It might. And I had to accept that. And I won't even say that it sucks. I just had to accept it. And it is hard. But I know this is what God called me to do. Otherwise, I wouldn't do it. And so I think the only way through this is accepting the heaviness of love, the responsibility of love, and talking about love openly and honestly. I know this was I don't know what kind of want to call this episode, an interesting episode, heavy episode, but we just had to discuss it in any kind of way. And so I want to thank you all for listening. Thank you all for joining us for the Progressive Christians podcast. Our podcast is a ministry of the Loft, the worship community of Westwood United Methodist Church. If you would like to connect with us and be a part of the conversation, you can find us on You can find us on all social media platforms at The Progressive Christians. Our show is mixed and edited by our wonderful audio engineer, AJ. If you like the show, please subscribe to us on all podcast platforms. If you especially like the show, please give a thumb down to all the haters, people who leave comments on YouTube that are just straight up hate. Just thumb them down so they can stop doing that, because that hurts my feelings, because it's moral injury. Go
leave some love on Blair's social media.
Exactly.
Add some positive comments.
Yeah. Exactly. Thank you. We'll see y'all later. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.